Hi, I'm Carys.
And I'm Gary Young.
Each week, Gary and I will be talking about those stories in the news that are overreported.
And the ones that are going completely under the radar and not being talked about enough.
This is Over the Top, Under the Radar.
If you want to support the show, we now have a Patreon. Search for Over the Top and Under the Radar on Patreon.
Gary, how are you doing?
I'm not bad. Thank you very much for asking. How are you?
I am good. We both saw the same film, Inside Out 2. Did you like it?
I think it's a good idea. And I thought it was quite well done. For those who haven't seen it, Inside Out is a kind of inside the mind of a girl. So you see there's an anger emotion, a sadness emotion, and there's joy, fear, I think. This is Inside Out 2, and now she's 13. And so the original emotions get rushed by anxiety and ennui and embarrassment. The one emotion that I thought, because she's hit puberty, the one emotion that I thought wasn't there, my memories of being 13 was horniness, or that kind of, it's a pretty crazy time to be a human being.
Yeah, crushes, fancying. That's true.
Yeah,
Maybe it's not a Pixar-friendly emotion.
I mean, there are ways of doing it, but yeah, I'm a 55-year-old man talking about why a 13-year-old girl on screen wasn't more horny, so I feel like I should just stop now.
Should we get into the apologies? Apologies, everyone.
I've already gone over the top.
Should I tell you what I think has gone over the top in the news this week?
Please.
Net migration. For those of you who don't know, net migration is the number you get when you subtract the number of people coming into the UK to work or to study or to live from the number of people leaving the UK to do the same thing or maybe retire. We've talked about this before. I don't love how we talk about immigration in the UK or in politics and the media. But I really think, I'm not going to say we've hit rock bottom, because every time I say that, the British political class are like, hold my beer. But I do think we reached a bit of a jump the shark moment this week. So Jump the Shark, obviously famously the Happy Days episode where Fonzie jumps over a shark, I think on his motorbike or a jet ski. And now it's synonymous with you've run out of ideas and it's going too far. So the Jump the Shark net migration moment for me was Nigel Farage.
You nearly called him Nigel Fart.
Nigel Fart, yeah, my brain, Freudian slip. So Nigel Farage, who may scarily listen to this podcast because he dropped not a manifesto, but like a promise to the electorate. It was only 25 pages. And there were a lot of policies in there, Gary. But the one that just really stuck out and made me think was his net migration pledge is zero. I really don't normally believe we should talk about immigration all the time on the left, because the more you talk about it, the more you're saying it's a really important thing. And I don't think it's as important as public sector cuts or the lack of housing. But we've now reached a point where Nigel Farage is saying net migration is going to be zero. That's bullshit. It's not realistic. It's also not sensible. And we've got a Tory party who, I think since 2010, when David Cameron was like, net migration's too high, we're going to get it down to the tens of thousands. That Tory party, over the last 14 years, has presided over a huge increase in net migration. Regardless of how you feel about that, like that's just factually accurate. So allowing for COVID when people weren't really traveling as much, net migration in 2023 was 685,000. Net migration in 2022 was over 700,000. And Brexit, which we were all told would help us to take back control of migration, resulted in lots of European people leaving, fewer European people coming in, and a huge increase in non-EU migration from India and Nigeria primarily, and also China. I want to get your take on it, Gary, but the reason I'm over net migration is I don't think it's the right number for us to be talking about. We palpably can't control it because a government that wanted to control it was unable to. We can maybe manage it like we manage inflation, interest rates. There's this other thing going on where there's like the fact of how many people are coming into the country, and there's what people believe and feel about migration. And facts and feelings are both important, but often they're not even connected to one another.
What I find weird about the immigration debate in this country is that it doesn't take place with any really sensible understanding of the country's needs. Ask anyone who's trying to get into a care home. Ask anyone who's been to hospital recently. Ask anyone who's travelled on a bus in most major cities or on the train service. Ask anyone who looks at the bloody English football team. Clearly, there is a role to play for people who come to this country. The thing I find most sad about things like this, because I'm assuming that he chose zero as net migration because he's playing on net zero and...
Oh yeah, he's branded his own net zero. The actual net zero, you know, the global warming, nah, scrap that bullshit.
So ridiculous. It's not meaningful and it's not achievable and it spreads arsenic in the water supply of our politics. I'm not sure that I think that we should stop talking about immigration if people feel it's an issue. Like last week, you were talking about vibes and values. If the vibe is that there are too many immigrants, we have to respond to that somehow. Going to people with facts doesn't really seem to help.
No, I completely agree. I think there are two things, though. On a factual basis, the number I think we should be talking about is one that you've mentioned, which is number of people coming to work in the health service versus number of vacancies, because a huge chunk of the new visas that we've given over the years since we left the European Union have been health and social care visas. And for those of you that went into the detail of the reform, not manifesto, contract, 25-page, I won't say anything rude. Interestingly, a little asterisk to Nigel Farage's it's going to be zero is, apart from skilled visas in sectors like health. So even Nigel Farage and Reform, not that they want you to know it, are saying we will let people come in on healthcare visas. I think if we are going to talk about it, talking about it in the context of skills gaps and skills shortages are the numbers we should be focused on. And then I completely agree with you. I think feelings matter, even if the feelings aren't rooted in reality. And we all know that from, you know, romantic relationships, friendships, family. If someone feels something really strongly, it's actually not useful or a kind response to say, well, you're wrong. And I think, you know, I was thinking back about the immigration debate over my lifetime. And for me, the moment that really summed that up was the 2010 election campaign where Gordon Brown was caught on a hot mic talking smack about Gillian Duffy. So Gillian Duffy lived in Rochdale, was retired, had caring responsibilities, was a widow. And the thing she specifically said to Gordon Brown, I mean, she threw a lot of stuff at him about the deficit and the debt, but she made a couple of comments about Eastern Europeans. Gillian Duffy felt that this was something that's concerning to her, but she also had facts on her side. The Polish population increased by over 10 times. So we went from near 60,000 Polish people to over 600,000 Polish people. That was a direct result of our membership of the European Union and Poland having access to free movement. Gordon Brown's response was to say, I shouldn't have had to speak to that woman. She was bigoted. Net migration, that number that we now all focus on, and if it's big, it's necessarily a bad thing, went from tens of thousands to consistently being in the hundreds of thousands in the 90s under New Labour. And I think that Gordon Brown moment is like, you have overseen policies that have brought hundreds of thousands of new people into the UK. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but to then be unwilling to hear someone talk about the impact of that or question the impact of that or feeling uncomfortable with change just sums up to me like the kind of hypocrisy and disrespect that we often see for the electorate. And then I think the other thing that really annoys me is this fallacy that the media perpetuate when they run migration numbers or they cover Farage's not manifesto, where they're like, well, you know, obviously we're not allowed to talk about immigration. No one wants to talk about it because they're scared they're going to be racist. And I'm like, hello, I call bullshit.
Yeah, the idea that you can't talk about immigration because people are too scared that they're going to be called racist. It's like, well, it's fine for you to talk about immigration. If you want to talk about immigration, then go ahead and understand please, that an awful lot of the talk about immigration is racist. So, I mean, it's one of those weird things where the accusation of racism becomes worse than the actual racism itself. But what is true, and I think you've pulled out here very well, is that because we don't talk about immigration intelligently, and because we don't talk about migration intelligently, including all of the people who come here because we bombed them, or the environmental collapse, economic policies that absolutely devastated Caribbean countries, neoliberal policies which wiped out the sugarcane in Barbados and the banana growing in St. Lucia and elsewhere. And if we're not going to talk about our place in the world, if we're not going to talk about our colonial past, then what the hell are we talking about? In the absence of all of those things, then nonsense can and does kind of creep in.
Ipsos polling done with British Future also has some pretty clear data that people prefer migrants from white Commonwealth countries. Like, if you ask them, do you want some more Canadians, maybe a few Australians, a little American or two, they're more into it than if it's people from black and brown countries. And again, like, that's the reality of people's attitudes. Like, that's just the reality, and we shouldn't be afraid to mention it. The other really interesting thing about attitudes to immigration, and that's where, you know, we do need to stay in the game and talk about it, because how we talk about it and what we say impacts what people think, is that the people, so if you say to people like, by occupation, do you want more fruit pickers? Do you want more care workers? Do you want more NHS staff? People are like, yeah. The one category of person where everyone's like, absolutely not, we don't want any more. Bankers, which is brilliant, because it actually shows, you know, we've always got to find hope as left-wing people, because often it feels like we're losing. But actually, because people feel like bankers don't add a lot socially, like they're not valuable people, people are more keen on fruit pickers coming over. So unskilled, if you even believe in that term, labor, they're much more happy for fruit pickers than more bankers. And that actually shows that if we engage meaningfully and like sensibly in these conversations, we can shape what people think. I love that British people are like, no more bankers. No. We got enough of them. Because they're right. We got enough of them.
My under the radar is Sudan. Sudan is facing a famine that could become the worst that the world has seen since Ethiopia. He's standing on the brink of this awful moment after over a year of fighting. I mean, the weapons are getting into the country, but the food is not. And the origin of this calamity it starts with something kind of positive in a way, which was the overthrow in 2019 of the dictator Omar al-Bashir. And a range of kind of paramilitary organizations and the Sudanese army were involved. They divided the spoils politically. There was supposed to be an interim government before it was a civilian rule. But then bit by bit, all of the civilian elements of that were removed. And you just got these two opposing groups, the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. And they have been in a bloody, murderous, calamitous battle for well over a year, which has displaced millions of people and has now reached the stage where the country is looking at imminent famine. And I was talking to someone with knowledge in this area, and she said it would be wrong to call it a civil war. It's a paramilitary war. It's two different groups of men with guns shooting and taking space and land and cities and starving the population in the process. I think the media treats these things a bit like, well, you know, a famine in Africa. Wait until you can show me the pictures of the babies with the hollowed out eyes, because it's not news, but it should be, and it could be. This war has gone on beyond its natural life because the United Arab Emirates are funding the Rapid Support Forces. And that does mean that pressure could be put on them because UAE is a big American ally. It is a lamentable situation.
Well, I think there are a couple of things. Thanks for picking it as your under the radar. I think there's the thing we all need to do, which is challenge ourselves to stay informed and engaged in stories that don't immediately impact us and aren't UK focused. And I think my guess would be that for a lot of people, there's a sense that there are parts of the world where things are always difficult, or there's always a war, or people are starving, and probably Sudan just like falls into people's head for that. So I think there's an obligation on all of us to understand what's going on. The other thing is, having worked for an MP, I'm not saying writing to your MP or your local representative fixes global problems, but politicians do notice when their mailbag is full on a certain topic, especially if people have taken the time to write. And obviously there are implications of this conflict in terms of the, no doubt, refugee numbers from Sudan and making sure that we're letting people in. There's still plenty to talk about, even though it's hard and harrowing.
You're right that we should do what we can. And there is also the issue of the arms and where the arms come from.
Yeah, we should always be asking about arms sales. We have, at least one extremely large arms manufacturer in the UK, probably several. BAE Systems is who I'm thinking of. So we are often making money out of conflicts. Also, Sudan is a former colony. And I just think we shouldn't be squeamish about, I mean, I don't believe in the Rudyard Kipling white man's burden, but I do think we have an outsized responsibility to countries that we colonized. I mean, I think it's like the mid 50s. Sudan was like, I think it was joint with Egypt. I'm not across the details, but like it's within living memory that we colonized Sudan. I don't think it's too much to ask that we take an outsized interest in what's going on now, especially because we fanned the flames of division while we were there or as we were leaving. It's kind of what the British Empire specialized in. So yeah, I think we should care about people all around the world, no matter where they're born or live. But, it definitely slightly falls a bit more in our column if we were all up in there colonizing everything.
Yes, that didn't help.
There's a brilliant Adam Curtis short film. I think it's called The Rise of Odir or Odirism from 2009. And it's actually about the Ethiopian famine. So it's quite a nice connection to what's going on now, which is the way that it's like the hollowing out of TV news and how really complex geopolitical events like a famine suddenly just become about, because we don't look into the history, the politics, or give a lot of context. We're just like, people starving, oh dear, rather than people having any sort of understanding or analysis of how you get famines, because famines are political, almost always the product of political decisions. And you're right that, in a few months we'll get the footage of the babies with edema and swollen bellies. It's not okay to tell yourself, well, that's just what it's like there. We have all got a duty to stay informed, even then we feel squeamish or it's upsetting, because we're still the lucky ones, right? We're still here in the UK. My under the radar is the recent decision not to prosecute the Stephen Lawrence detectives. Another upsetting story, but one that I think is important. So probably everyone listening will know who Stephen Lawrence is. He was killed in Eltham in a racist murder in 1993. So over 30 years ago now, he and his friend were attacked by 6 men. Because they were black, Stephen died. His friend survived and was an eyewitness. What the Lawrence family had to deal with after their son was taken from them was a bungled and undeniably racist handling of the case by the Metropolitan Police, which led to the McPherson report, which famously said that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist. And what the kind of latest part of this was that the Lawrence family were trying to get the 4 detectives who ran that first murder investigation to face criminal charges for the fact that they didn't try and find Stephen Lawrence's killer. The CPS decided not to prosecute, and the Lawrence family asked for an independent review of that decision. CPS have basically said no. They're happy to meet the Lawrence family and walk them through why it's a no. But yeah, it's a no to prosecuting the police. I don't know. I think if you're black and British, you never want anything to do with Stephen Lawrence to go under the radar or for us to forget what's happened. I guess I'm a bit shocked at how little coverage this got or little conversation, given 2 things. Last year, the BBC identified the 6th suspect in Stephen's murder. They took the decision to name him.
Because he died, right?
He died. But when you get into it, Gary, this guy's stepdad came to the police. He approached them. His stepson had told him that he was involved. The main eyewitness who was attacked said there were 6 people. And then, we talk a lot in our politics about deterrence when it comes to immigration. There is no deterrent to the Met Police to behave appallingly. These people never face consequences. And I'm pissed off because we just had another review, the Casey review, years on from McPherson being like, the Met Police is still institutionally racist. It's also institutionally sexist and homophobic. The review associated with Sarah Everard, where a man who most people agree should never have been allowed to be a police officer was allowed to join the Met. His bad behavior was ignored. And then he kidnapped and murdered a woman. I'm kind of shocked at how little we're talking about the Met Police and how awful they are.
The narrative from the right is just let the police do their job. Like, you keep going on about racism. They're afraid to be racist, so they won't do their job. And what the Stephen Lawrence case showed was, no, racism was preventing them from doing their job. That was the problem. That if they were doing their job, they would have found those people and they would have built a case and they would have charged them and they would have been in prison. It was the racism that prevented them from doing their job, that assumed that Stephen and his friend were somehow kind of part of a gang. And then, the guy walks in and says, my son was part of it. And they're like, we'll better sit on that for a while. We'll better think about that. But I'm also intrigued because you mentioned Sarah Everard. This is one of those cases where you can see how people siloing off their struggles actually weakens everyone. Stephen Lawrence murder and the bungling of his case, the willful negligence around his case, was understood as a racial problem, which it was. It was almost like it being a racial problem took it out of it being a policing problem, which it also was. It wasn't just a racial problem with the police. It was a problem with the way the police operated. If people had sufficiently understood that it wasn't just a racial problem, then there might have been more white women involved. There might have been more other people who saw themselves as being vulnerable. But that it took Sarah Everard. I mean, I know there have always been women campaigning on safety and policing and particularly prosecutions for rape and things like that. But it took a moment like that for that then to kind of occur en masse.
I mean, we can go even further when we're thinking about the Met. Go back to the shooting of Jean-Charles de Menezes in 2005. For those of you who don't remember, a Brazilian man killed at Stockwell tube station because they thought he'd been involved in the 7/7 bombings. I don't want to talk about the police in general. I want to talk about the Met Police, because the Met Police, we now know over decades, has been proven to be so intrinsically racist, the Casey Review says homophobic and sexist, that they cannot do their job. And then we have these individual cases. Those killings epitomize how harmful and awful that failure is and that it has real consequences. We have reviews and investigations and inquiries, and no individual police officers are responsible. And the Met gets a sort of telling off, but no meaningful reform. If this were a company, if this were a charity, like, it would be on special measures. Like, you would be blowing the whole thing up. I guess my question is, like, what will it take for us to have a serious conversation about how fucked up the Metropolitan Police Force is and how urgently it is in need of complete reform, complete overhaul? The Firearms Command Unit is the unit that I believe Sarah Everard's killer and John Paul Menezes' killer both come from. The specific stuff about that unit, the number of allegations against its officers, I think it was 56 allegations and 4 had formal action. So it's been laid out pretty clearly, but still we do nothing. And so for me, yeah, that is under the radar. We should be talking about it more. And it's weirdly, unlike immigration, an area where we have complete control over the Met Police. They are public sector employees. They work for the government.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because it is a totemic case. I wish Dorian and Neville all luck in pursuing it. Politically, I think it's important that we continue to understand it also as a case that is a proxy for all of the cases that go under our radar. I did a series in The Guardian on knife crime called Beyond the Blade. One of the things that they say in Scotland, where they've done a tremendous job by understanding knife crime as a public health crisis and treating it as such. But when it talked about London, one of the key things they said was one of the challenges the Metropolitan Police has is it doesn't have the trust of the community where people are most likely to be stabbed and the community where people are most likely to do the stabbing. They don't have the trust in that community, and it's almost impossible to do this without that. And so this lack of trust, this lack of accountability, this lack of taking responsibility, it makes us all unsafe. My other top is Windrush. June the 22nd is Windrush Day. I will be speaking at an event with the National Education Union. Like most Caribbean people with a pulse are regaled or invited to do something on Windrush Day. So I am engaging in it. For those who don't know, Windrush, the HMS Windrush was the boat that brought over 800 Jamaicans and several others, including Poles, to Britain. It docked in Tilbury in 1948, and it became the symbolic arrival of post-colonial migrants. Actually, 1948, people didn't really start coming in large numbers until kind of mid-50s. And Windrush Day is to celebrate the contributions of migrants in general, I would say, and Caribbean migration in particular. People fought very hard so that we would have a day. I respect that, and I'm glad for that. But that day is being co-opted, I fear. It is National Treasure Day. Pathé News footage and Lord Kitchener in pork pie hat singing London is a Place for Me Day. Windrush Day was founded in 2017. The Windrush scandal broke in 2018. So 1 year after. And I don't want to hear the government talking about Windrush Day when they're still shafting the people who were the victims of the Windrush scandal. And for those who don't know, the Windrush scandal is a shameful, shameful episode, which is still ongoing in a way, where large numbers of mainly Caribbean migrants who came to Britain before 1971, who were British citizens, found themselves deprived of their citizenship, pauperized, kicked out of their council houses, denied urgent medical care, fired from their jobs, in some cases deported, in others refused to be allowed to come back because of the hostile environment that had been brought about by Theresa May, and which Labour had voted for too, actually. Most of them have not had compensation. Clearly the government is waiting out the clock, in an expectation that they'll die before they have to. This week alone, a court struck down Suella Braverman's decision. Suella Braverman, who was a previous Home Secretary, was given a list of recommendations, and she just decided not to do a couple of them because she wasn't feeling it. So this is another case of an ongoing trauma and injustice that is not being solved, where the government and the state is not doing right by people. So there's that connection with Stephen Lawrence, but there's also the way in which Windrush are now held up as the model migrants. In the same way that Stephen became held up, all you knew about Stephen is that he wanted to be an architect, that he was unworthy of this attack, which suggests other people were worthy, and that the Windrush generation is now, after all the racism they've faced, all the low wages and the disrespect, they're now like benighted, This is the kind of immigration that this country, and they played by the laws and they played by the rules and all this kind of nonsense. And the reality isn't that they shouldn't have been treated like that. It's that nobody should have been treated like that. The hostile environment, the problem with the hostile environment isn't that it got the wrong people. It's that anybody that it gets is wrong. It's wrong. It's wrong to treat people like that. The Windrush scandal was not a glitch in the system. It was the system.
What jumped out to me as someone who, this isn't, other than being part of a Black diaspora, like this isn't my family's story, is that, it's not that we've gone over the top on Windrush is that we need to fight for the meaning of Windrush and to not lose the political activism and campaigning and the sense of like what it represents. So less that we're over it being talked about, but more that we're not talking about the right things. Is that how you feel?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And when I say over the top, what I mean is that the state will sell it as a kind of celebration of their genius. You know, weren't we good? Didn't we do this well? Isn't this lovely? I don't want the word in their mouth. Do you know what I mean? Not until they've paid those people, not until they've compensated those people.
Or implemented the basic recommendations of the review that they conducted. I think it's also a cautionary tale to those of us tempted by those like good immigrant or model minority narratives because, so yeah, I grew up in working class community in London. And my brother and I were like joking about the things that you had shame or prejudice about. So like, oh, we were poor, but we weren't so poor. We had to shop at Lidl. You didn't bring a Lidl carrier bag into school, which is something that, you know, kids bullied each other over because, you know, kids are.
Really?
Yeah, like being...
That's so specific.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very specific to Brixton and the supermarkets that were there. But, you know, shopping at Tesco, you're like a rung up from shopping at Lidl because Lidl's for really poor people, but you're only slightly poor because you can afford Tesco value. And we were just sort of joking about that like logic. But I think the siren call of jumping into the deserving poor or the good Black people who have middle class aspirations and their son wants to be an architect, or, oh, well, the migrants that were invited here on a boat and so deserve to be treated well. We have to always challenge and like reject the siren call of, yeah, the deserving poor, the good immigrants. That category changes at the whim of the people who benefit from these narratives. It's pretty short-sighted to assume that you can't suddenly be relegated to the bad category.
With that in mind, and we've gone off topic a bit, but there was a story from my life which was really, really challenging, which is that I used to walk Ossie, my son, to nursery. This is in America, in Chicago. And at one stage, he says to me, "Can we go this way?" And I said, "No, this way's quicker." And, you know, I didn't know what he was on about and I didn't want to take longer to get there. And I managed to catch myself and say, "Well, why?" And he said, "They keep stopping Black boys that way." And I said to him, and you know, there were all these shorthands and it caught me off guard and you're walking to school. I said, "Well, it's all right. They won't stop us." And he said, "Why not?" And I said, "Well, we haven't done anything." And he said, "Well, what have they done?" And I was defeated by my 4-year-old. I was like, "You know what, son, you're right. We should just walk the other way. We should take the other route." That's the route that we took. But it speaks to, I was floundering around mostly because I wanted to go the short way, but how easy it is to slip into the notion of worthy, unworthy. I was really, without thinking about it, which is a problem, saying to him, "We're worthy and they're not." And he was like, "Well, what makes us worthy?" And I was like, "Yeah, no, I don't know." I don't know.
Yeah, and I think we're fed it all the time. And actually, we should just lower the stakes and be, you know, like racism is like the rain that's falling. And even if you've got an umbrella, you're going to get a bit wet. So I think, you know, we've all absorbed this stuff and we all perpetuate it. And so the battle is within our own minds as well as within society.
Carys, that was very poetic.
Thank you, Gary. I can be poetic sometimes.
Yeah, I can feel a t-shirt coming up.
Yeah, so many t-shirts now. It's not all sex jokes and Nigel Farage chat.
Nigel Farage.
Yeah, Nigel Farage. But I think there is a connection to something we want to talk about. There's an interesting connection between Windrush and that history and a very special guest that we've got coming up on an episode of the podcast. And there's a dedicated interview that Patreon subscribers will get first, but everyone will get to hear. We had a chat with Mick Lynch, who's the General Secretary of the RMT. His parents were both Irish immigrants. He really has a kind of Irish identity. And we talk a bit about it in the interview, so stay tuned for that or sign up to Patreon if you want to be the first to hear it, what that identity meant. And yeah, Irish people are a category of people who have become white or whiter within living memory. So yeah, I guess like people who came over on the Windrush and Caribbean families really have that lived experience of how the goalposts move and suddenly you're a different category of person. Talk about immigration, Brexit.
And his plans for taking on a new Labour government.
You're now about to hear a very special clip from our interview with Mick Lynch, which will drop on Patreon in the next few days and be on the main feed next week.
I think what the coming period when we get a Labour government is a period of opportunity, but we can't let them just run. I know they're the government, but we can't let them just run it the way they want to run it. We've got to make sure they're under manners, as my mother would have said. probably a lot of other people's mothers back in the day. They've got to be put under manners.
Kids got to be put under manners.
And made to deliver for working people in lots of different places on lots of different issues. It's a really tough job they've got, by the way. Even if they were more or closer to what I would want to see, they would have a really tough battle. And the right wing is going to come down on them so hard. Last week they were saying that Starmer, it wants a one-party socialist state and all this stuff, and that pensioners are rapidly withdrawing all their savings and going to move to Florida. It's just nonsense. They're trying to create this scare. So if they were to do that to them, imagine what they would have done to Corbyn if he got power, or what they'll do if Labour move to the left, which is what we've got to try and achieve. So there's an opportunity coming our way, and there'll be a bit of joy.
Okay, so before we leave, I wanted to give a big thank you, as always, for all the messages and feedback that we got. And I wanted to read something from an anonymous listener about what you said, Gary, last week about younger generations and taxation. So this person who wants to be anonymous said, what you said about a transfer of hope very much resonated with me. For me, the issue is that while I want money to be directed to where it's most needed, and I would also benefit from a society where everyone has better quality of life, the part of the state that is most letting me down is the support for carers and mental health. Being a young carer with increasingly deteriorating mental health. As your podcast highlights, there are an abundance of things that affect loads of people that aren't on the main agenda. What I'm saying is it's harder to be willing to pay more tax when you know you won't see change in the thing that's most affecting you with any sort of urgency. And there's not much public will for it either. I won't read the whole message, but I thought we did ask younger listeners to get in touch, and really appreciate the person that wrote in here, and also so much respect and appreciation for you as a young carer. It's just, yeah, as ever, some of the most valuable roles in our society are not reflected in the amount of appreciation and support you get. But I thought it was quite a powerful and, I guess, fair challenge around the tax issue, and feeling like the thing you really need public support for hasn't got much funding.
Yes, that was a very powerful message. There was also this on Twitter from Sasha Josette, who responded to our call for a Patreon and said, had exactly this money floating around having left Labour, so decided to use the subs to support Over and Under with Gary Young and Carys. It's a bloody brilliant decision for my political education. You won't be disappointed, I promise. Give it a go. Thank you so much, Natasha Josette.
And to everyone who signed up to support us on Patreon.
Thank you. We really do appreciate it. Thanks for listening to Over the Top and Under the Radar. Remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And make sure you sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com.
And connect with us on socials at over_under_pod_.